Hello and welcome to Tin Tower Talks, an occasional podcast where I, Umbreon Libris, have interesting conversations with other members of the Pokemon community. Today we're going to talk about the educational side of Pokemon YouTube. When we talk about Pokemon from a number of different angles, we have the opportunity to teach our viewers something new on a variety of topics. Loxton is probably the biggest name that's more dedicated to this, but there are quite a few smaller channels in this space as well, and even some channels that don't have much of an educational bent sometimes will dip their toes in it, for better or for worse. My two guests today are, like me, part of this ecosystem of smaller channels trying to serve up some education along with their Pokemon, and they're also longtime friends of the channel. So please welcome Derek Triforce.
Hello, I'm Derek Triforce, or just Derek for short. I principally focus on making educational content, of course, like culture, history, geography, psychology, and even business. I also sometimes do theories and list videos that a lot of other content creators do, but as I've gotten older, that's sort of gone on the wayside, and I focus more on educational, my niche, so to speak, there.
Yeah, I think it's good to have that kind of focus, and like everyone does the listicle stuff, right? So it's nice to have something that differentiates you. And welcome Gavin of Palette University and the I Wish You Were Dead podcast.
Yeah, so like Libra said, my name's Gavin. I ran the Palette University YouTube channel. It's sort of on hiatus at the moment, just due to a big life change. I moved from South Dakota to New York, then to California. So my life's kind of all over the place right now, but it'll be back at some point, ideally. But in the meantime, a friend of mine, sometime probably around this time last year, sort of hit me up about doing a podcast, not Pokemon related at all, but more just like general science education. I myself have a background in biology and geology, as well as my main focus being paleontology, which is a nice fusion of the two. And so that's sort of what I geared most of my Pokemon-based content on, is some of the more biological aspects mostly. I wish that I could have focused a little more on Pokemon geology, but they really don't give you too much to go on in any of the main games. So, but mostly Pokemon evolution, Pokemon biology and physiology is mostly what I've talked about.
I think it's really interesting to have the perspective of someone who's actually studied it, like who has a degree in it, not just someone who does their research. You know, like we're all kind of, or most of us anyway, are kind of lay people. So as good as our research can be, we don't have that kind of expert perspective. So Derek, since you were the one who brought this topic to me, I wanted to hear from you. Why does it matter to you?
So, you can't really tell it now, but when I was younger, I couldn't learn or read or anything. I had ADHD, so school just did not work for me. I always noticed that I was gravitating towards educational programming, such as public broadcasting, shows like Wildcrats, Cyber Chase. These, of course, are all American, so you may be unfamiliar. And these shows kept my interest in learning alive, because standardized tests just don't measure that. It just measures how much you remember the material, and if you're good at multiple choice, you're going to pass anyway, even if you don't actually understand the material. And as I got older, I transitioned away from television and started watching YouTube more, and I found myself watching channels like Vsauce, Tom Scott, Lindy Beige, and so much more. These channels just kept me interested and enthralled in my subjects, and even stuff that I don't have any interest in. Like, I can't stand math, but for some reason I can watch someone talk about math if they really enjoy it. And that's something I love about educational entertainment, because even if you're not into the education part, it's still entertainment. So you get to enjoy that. Even now, now that I'm in college and having to face the COVID situation with school basically losing all of its experience and just becoming work, I have noticed that textbooks, homework, and tests just don't work for me, and I have to go and look at alternative means of learning the same material. And that is partially why I created one of my series to look at business because that's what I'm studying, and I wanted to find a way to stop using examples from companies I don't care about like Nike and start looking at it through a Pokemon perspective. And it has opened my world to Pokemon as a business and learning and seeing the tactics they are actually using.
YouTube really does have a very, very nice educational environment. Like there's a very large number of very, very good educational creators. Or just channels and networks more generally, like SciShow.
Oh yeah, them. I love them.
I think all of us here watch the SciShow network. But yeah, like Vsauce is absolutely fantastic. Veritasium is another one that I love. And there's a range, right? There's like not just... I think most of these that I'm mentioning, like they are science communicators, and those are mostly the ones that I watch. But there's absolutely everything.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm not too into it like studying on my own, but science is something that does interest me quite a bit, and watching these content creators has made me understand science so much more. I always tend to focus more on history and stuff, so you'll be seeing me watch History Buffs or something where they break down a movie and see how historically accurate it is. Or look at the mythological culture of a civilization you haven't heard of in 6 years, and you're like, whoa, wow, so that's where that one creature from that one video game came from. Yep.
Yeah. Gavin, you actually have a science communication podcast. As you were telling us. So tell us a little bit more about how you go about making that. And if you could talk a little bit about where you think it's successful and where it might not be quite up to snuff.
Yeah. So the podcast is something that I sort of, like I mentioned, that one of my friends, we've been friends for almost, 10 years. I ended up posting a picture of a rattlesnake that I found when I was out doing some field work that I accidentally got a little dangerously close to. So I ended up posting a picture on my Facebook, and he commented and was like, "You always have like the wackiest stories to tell. You should start a podcast or something." And I'm like, "Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate that, but I'm in grad school and definitely don't have that time." And then he was like, "Well, what if you just talked into a mic for an hour and some idiot did the rest of the work?" And I literally told him, like, "Hey, you're an idiot." And and thus, I Wish You Were Dead was born. So he is a high school history teacher. He teaches mostly American history. And that's one of my favorite things about our podcast. Most education-based podcasts that I've listened to mostly have two people who are like the content expert, which I'm sure makes both of their lives easier because they can sort of split the work. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's really nice to be able to get that layperson's perspective because he has not taken a science class since like his senior year of high school. I think he may have taken one his freshman year of college, but it's been at least 7 or so years since he's taken any form of science. And so he's a pretty good metric for where the general public is, which as scientists or any kind of content expert, you kind of lose track of where the general public is on your given topic because you take so much of your own knowledge for granted. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think our podcast does really, really well. Because I know a lot of the other, our podcast focuses mostly on paleontology and, earth science and biology. And a lot of other podcasts that I listen to, I'm sure they do an excellent job. But I'm sure if Mike were to listen to them without me to sort of pause and explain things, he might get a little lost. And that's not, a hit on him or them, the other podcast creators at all. That's just maybe not the audience that they're gearing for, which is a really important thing to keep in mind anytime you're making content. So I think that's something that our show does really well. Mm-hmm.
I actually really like how usually near the start of the episode, you will ask Mike what he knows about the topic. And, sometimes his response, I'll be like, "Well, you know a lot more about this than I do. So, I feel like I'm behind." And then sometimes his response, I'll be like, I mean, that's like nothing compared to what I know.
Exactly. So I feel like, obviously a larger sample size is more helpful.
Yeah.
So it'd be better to have, maybe one other person to just sort of bounce an idea off of. But I feel like he's generally a pretty good metric. Especially maybe he's becoming less good of a metric now that we've been doing the show for almost a year. He's learning, and I'm very proud of him. But yeah, some places I think it sort of falls a little short is sort of the other side of having like the only one sort of content expert is that sometimes I'm just busy and don't have enough time to put into the episode that I wish that I did. And it would be nice to have, another content expert there to fill in some of the gaps. Because I know every episode I always sort of put a blanket statement on that, like, I'm going to miss stuff. I just am. Mm-hmm. And it's really nice in that, he's sort of a content expert in his own thing that is vaguely associated. So I think he's done 4 episodes that are just sort of blanket called Mike Takes the Wheel, where he talks about somebody from like American history who's also dead. So, it still fits sort of the theme of the podcast. And I've been really, really amazed by some of the relatively like obscure people that he's talked about in American history who have really, really important stories to tell, but I had never really heard of before. But yeah, so definitely getting some gaps filled in is probably one of the main places that I want to steer the podcast more toward.
Mm-hmm. And I think that leads in well to talking about the way that the Pokemon creators address the edutainment is that most of the time we are not experts, right?
Right.
Or like even in your case, you are like you have the knowledge in the biology, in the paleontology, the geology, but maybe a specific topic, like if you're talking about a specific group of organisms, that might not be your area of expertise. And so obviously you need to do the research there to get up to speed, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were even a number of times where I, somebody in the comments or even just myself coming across something like weeks, maybe even like months later, where it's like, oh, okay, there's like a Pokedex entry that contradicts something that I said, or something in one of the games that like so provides a better line of evidence for something that I was arguing for anyway, but I missed. So it's like, as much as I love Pokemon, my Pokemon world knowledge is also not the best on YouTube for sure.
No, that's true. Like I was thinking more on the like scientific side, but yeah, even though we are quote unquote experts in Pokemon, I think all of us probably still miss a lot of things. I've certainly
absolutely
had that experience of like later finding out either through a comment or through just playing a game later and being like, oh, this would have been important to include, or this might have changed my opinion. Derek, have you had that experience before?
To an extent, like I've been playing Pokemon for years, so my world knowledge is quite advanced, I guess. I tend to not really touch on the world too much. I'm more focused on teaching about real life stuff and researching into that. But compared to you all, I'm actually quite young. I'm only 21, and I've been doing YouTube. Yeah, a little baby. I've been doing YouTube since I was 15, and just gonna be straight honest, I was awful at research at that age. I did not know how to research things, write papers, or any of that stuff. And I was still making videos talking about stuff that interested me and stuff I did have some knowledge on, but not anything more than just, I read a book on that 3 years ago. Awesome. But now that I've gotten older, I've been to college, I've had an actual teacher who grilled into me the research methods and stuff. I look at my older videos and I'm like, God, I miss so much detail. I actually had a problem recently in some of my newer stuff that I haven't actually made because I can't focus at all. Wonderful. I make my videos a bit too long because there's so much to talk about and I don't know when to stop talking. If I had anything to do with it and I started talking about like, the Persian Empire, in 30 minutes, I'd be talking about Rome, modern America, and then suddenly now we're back at Greece, and now it's China. And did you know there was a massive treasure fleet from China? And I'm like, wait a second, we were talking about Pikachu. So that's the problem I face, but I've gotten a lot better with it over the years.
Do you find that using the Pokemon to kind of ground your research and your or just your topic of your video that helps?
Oh yeah, definitely. It allows me to focus on specifically these attributes. There are times where I used to just use Bulbapedia and just basically make a video Bulbapedia article, and I don't do that anymore. Now I just use Bulbapedia as like a sort of foundation, and then I just bounce off of that. So Bulbapedia says this is a potential inspiration. You bet I'm going to my public library getting books on Greek mythology to look at this inspiration. Oh, suddenly there's a mention of dancing with Volcarona, so let me go look at Egyptian gods, and which god was a dancing god. Oh, there you go. There's one. I can't remember it. I've made that video 2 years ago. Please, I beg your forgiveness. I'm not all too into Egyptian mythology, but it allows me to like just look at the Pokemon and be like, okay, here's all the potential inspirations. For like example, the move Will-O-Wisp, it's based on a real folklore, but there's like 6 or 7 different names for Will-O-Wisp, Swamp Lights, Lantern Man, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I just have to draw a line and be like, okay, there's just a bunch of folklore that's this, move on. But once you've finished covering everything you can about a Pokemon, you're pretty much done. Or all the stuff about Nagasaki and Slateport City, boom, you're done. You don't have to really go into any further detail because covered it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at one point you do reach the end, or at least the end of what's reasonable.
Oh, yeah.
And it's funny that you mentioned Bulbapedia because I also heavily used Bulbapedia. Mostly for myself as a reference to things that may have happened in the anime, as unreliable as the anime is. But since most of my videos are based on like the biology, I can more or less look at a Pokemon and know, make a video about its biology in general. But one of my favorite videos that I made was my video about Archeops. And I spent at least like a third to maybe even like up to half of the video ranting about like the main Archeops episode of the Black and White anime because it was so bad. And I would never have found that. And that was one of my personal favorite, like most entertaining, just for me to make. I can't really speak to how it was to watch, but for me to make, which was really fun because, and I would never have found that episode of the anime without like checking Bulbapedia. Because to me, like Archeops is, should be a predator, right? I'm pretty sure even Pokedex entries mention that it, hunts its prey or something to that effect. But for whatever reason, I guess the show didn't want to depict that. It's almost like it's for kids or something. So they have it eat a bunch of fruit. And I'm like, well, that goes against literally everything else about this Pokemon. And then I just fell down that rabbit hole.
I use Bulbapedia pretty extensively myself, but I've also criticized Bulbapedia extensively before. It's a very good resource, but you have to know its limits, right? Like, I use it all the time to refresh my memory about video game stuff as well. Like, even though the video games are my focus, my area of expertise, you could say, I can't go back and play through an entire game just to remember, one line.
Right.
Just to be like, what was that thing that Lysander said? Like, I have to find that somewhere, and Bulbapedia is usually a good place to find quotes. But it isn't perfect because it is a community thing.
Right.
And especially if you're looking, like Derek was talking about, looking at the origins and the inspirations of the Pokemon. If you just look at what's on Bulbapedia, that might give you a good place to start. But that's not going to be enough. And I do know a lot of creators only look at that stuff on Bulbapedia. A lot of people who aren't creators look at that stuff on Bulbapedia and treat it as if it's fact. I remember having a comment at one point. I don't remember which Pokemon it was that I was talking about, but I said, I made some speculation or something about what the origin, what the inspiration was, and someone made a comment saying, "Well, Bulbapedia says this," as if that is proof of anything.
As I've gotten much better at researching and actually remembered stuff and have expanded my knowledge on all the fields that I touch on, I can look at Bulbapedia articles and be like, that's missing a lot of inspirations. Like the Lake Guardians, there is nothing on the actual psychological side because everything about the Lake Guardians, willpower, memory, emotions, that's all to do with the brain. And there's so much you can talk about there. And I spent like 5 minutes talking about it, and it actually inspired a brand new series on my channel, Pokemon Psych. So yay, thanks Bulbapedia for not including something.
Or a lot of times I've noticed that they'll include something that say what you will about like base Wikipedia. For the most part, at least in my realm of like science things, Wikipedia is actually very reliable. It might not have the most up-to-date things, but you'll find very little just like outright incorrect information. But like Bulbapedia, I'll see like, this Pokemon may have been based off of, this prehistoric dinosaur or something to that effect. And I'll just kind of like cock my head and be like, I don't see it at all. And this is what I do. And and I'm like, I'm really curious who put that there, or like if they had like, an action figure of that Pokemon when they were a little kid and also dinosaur action figures and somehow are like conflating the two. I don't know. But yeah, sometimes on Bulbapedia, there's just stuff that needs a lot of correction.
If we change a little bit our focus and talk about using Pokemon to teach people, whether that's about science, rather, history, whatever. What do you think are the important or the advantages of using Pokemon as kind of like that starting point?
To me, it's very approachable. I've been sitting in my business classes recently, and I don't even bother really paying attention to the examples. I'm too busy trying to figure out a way to make strategic management theory relatable in a Pokemon way, and I thought of one, which was like basically calling Giovanni out for being a good leader, but being a really horrible manager for continuously making Jesse and James go after Pikachu, even though they have clearly shown that they're capable in other fields. I'm always taking that approachability of Pokemon and being like, okay, let's see. Okay, what's some psychological stuff? What is mentally disturbed about Cyrus? What is the inspiration behind this folkloric, this Pokemon and its folklore? Thank you for teaching me about global marketing. Let me look at all the tactics Pokemon used to branch out from Japan to the United States, which was incredibly difficult and almost never happened. And I think another benefit to Pokemon is when you're creating a channel and you enjoy Pokemon and you're talking about it, it shows.
Yeah.
You enjoy the topic. Yeah, you might enjoy history, science, and stuff, but you also enjoy the franchise. So I think some edutainment channels that touch on everything, all the video games, tend to show that they may not have any interest in a certain video game because they're like, I played this game for 20 hours and just never touched it again. And now they're trying to dissect it when I've played Pokemon for well over 8,000, 10,000 hours. And now I'm dissecting it and like, I know everything about this.
Or even potentially with like some of larger channels who the person on camera might not be the same person that wrote the script. And the person who wrote the script is really into it and loves the franchise. But that doesn't necessarily convey if the person, on the camera isn't as enthusiastic, So that's definitely something super relatable, because that's something that like not that I'm like a teacher, but I did teach a couple labs in grad school. But it's like, if you are not interested in having fun, the people you are trying to educate are not going to be interested in having fun. Yeah. And that's like, and I've talked to my podcast co-host, like I said, who's like a high schooler, sometimes depending on, I think he has taught middle school before as well, but that's like one of the first things they teach you in like your teaching classes is, like if you are not into it, if you're just standing up at the front of the class and, you're just talking in a monotone voice, your students are going to tune out and they're going to get nothing out of it.
Yeah, that's something I've noticed a lot because of COVID and making everything distance learning. The teachers just lost all interest because they're not familiar with it and they don't enjoy it that way. And as a student, it has irreversibly hurt me over the last year as well.
Yeah, for me, using Pokemon, like you said, sort of just as like a frame of reference, because like from the beginning, I told myself I wanted to approach the channel as this is a science channel masquerading as a Pokemon channel. Because like the science was always going to come first. And then, I would potentially either just be explore Bulbapedia looking for some science or science adjacent words, or sometimes I would kind of literally just like scroll through the Pokedex and find an interesting Pokedex entry, or even just like a Pokemon who is based off of like some weird, random animal that's not all that popular. And then those tend to be the animals that I like the best and some of my favorites. So I'm like, I want to tell people about how cool this real life animal is, but they're probably most familiar with it in its Pokemon form. So that's the easiest way for me to introduce this animal to them, because they're probably already familiar with it, just not the way it is in the real world.
Yeah, I like doing that as well. Just like, hey, that Pokemon you like, or that thing in Pokemon that you like. What if we go deeper and, try to explore it a little bit more? But like at the same time, I do feel like it can cause some problems because I'm trying to use a Pokemon thing to talk about a real life thing. And I always try to make that clear, but sometimes the viewer doesn't always pick up on that transition. So if I say this is how it works in Pokemon, but this is, it works a little bit differently in real life, and it can be difficult to really communicate that I'm talking about two different things, and what I'm saying is the way it works in real life that may not apply to Pokemon. And sometimes the viewer is like, oh well, but it's a fantasy, and like, of course it's a fantasy. So obviously in Pokemon there's going to be elements that simply cannot translate to real life, but I always try to make that equivalence, right? Because what attracts me to Pokemon is the more scientific side of it rather than the more fantastical side of it. I like how I don't know, research-esque the first few generations were, right? It's just like you're going out and doing field work and discovering things for yourself. Obviously, like, Pokemon has that fantasy element, and I have to kind of remove that to talk about the real-life inspirations, the real-life relationships, whatever that may be. And that doesn't always translate that well, I guess.
Yeah, and it's I really like that you said sort of like the first couple of generations were much more science-y, even though if they were much more limited just in a lot of their other scopes being Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, but that was something that I didn't realize how much I missed until I played New Pokemon Snap.
Oh, yeah.
Because the entire point of that game is you are a researcher's assistant in this new place, which, granted, they did send some mixed messages about whether people had actually been there before or people actually lived in this region.
Mm-hmm.
They sent some mixed messages, but the general vibe was like, you're some of the first humans to ever be here, and you're documenting it in a scientific way, which, granted, there's some very large, like, colonial-esque vibes historically to science doing that in, quote-unquote, previously undiscovered places. But that was something, like I said, that I really didn't realize how much I enjoyed about the first couple generations until I played New Pokemon Snap when it came out this year.
Yeah, New Pokemon Snap is so lovely.
It really is.
I have yet to play it. Oh
man, it's really worth it. It's just like, I didn't particularly enjoy the gameplay, and so I completed the game, but I didn't discover all of the secrets and anything like that. But it's just such a pleasure to experience, I guess.
It's just an incredibly relaxing game. That's like one of the biggest takeaways that I had from it. It's like, if I just got done with, class for the day, or, I was potentially procrastinating grading some lab assignments, I was just like, you know what? Let's go take some pictures.
Mm-hmm.
My biggest sort of potential negative or drawback is a better way to phrase it, of talking about Pokemon in this way is that it almost sort of pigeonholes you a bit. Because for me, at least with the content that I made for the channel, it was like if there wasn't already a Pokemon precedent for it, it made it kind of hard to justify making a video about it. particularly in paleontology, because there's only less than 30 off the top of my head fossil Pokemon. There are many non-fossil Pokemon that take inspiration from fossil animals or plants in the real world, but there's obviously hundreds and thousands of really amazing extinct animals that I couldn't really justify making a video about because there wasn't that Pokemon precedent for it for me to use as an excuse to be making that video to begin with.
This kind of goes to one of the points I just wrote down recently, is that Pokemon's very niche, and if you're going to look at your channel like a business, which if you're monetizing it, that's what it is. It's a business.
Yeah.
And you have to focus on your niche, and that niche limits you. But limitation does breed creativity. When I first started my channel and started incorporating some series, I had Poke profiles. There was a precedent for that. There was Dexperts from Swanwick, who's a very, very small creator. I don't think he makes them anymore. The National Dex, which I don't think they make videos anymore. And then there was Exalians. I forgot what his was called, but there was a precedent for it. I had something to go off of, something to base my style on. And then I made Geographic, which is just the same thing, but take out the Pokemon and put the location. But when I made Psychology and Castilla Insider, that had not been done before to my knowledge, and I had to completely rethink how to do those videos, and I was kind of afraid that I was going to break my niche in going too far into real life and losing that Pokemon focus. But thankfully, I don't think I busted that. But that niche is what can stifle a channel, especially if you're not thinking outside the box, trying to come up with stuff. It takes me a long time to come up with video ideas. I spend more time coming up with video ideas than actually making videos.
Yeah, I feel like I don't really have that problem. I mean, I guess I do because I probably don't grow as much as I could if I was maybe a little bit more focused and a little bit more specialized. But I do kind of go everywhere with my topics. I just kind of make a video about whatever I feel like. But yeah, I don't normally have a real life thing that I want to talk about and then have to figure out how to tie that into Pokemon. Usually I have a Pokemon experience or like something that I see in a game or something that I realize about my playstyle or something like that I then want to go more in depth and explore the real life counterparts to that. I'm working on a few videos that started that way, but when just thinking back to one of my previous videos, I did a whole series on the genetics and reproduction of Pokemon, right? Like it's 3 videos, it's an hour long. That was me like looking at Pokemon theories about the way that Pokemon genetics and Pokemon breeding works, and then trying to not look only at the Pokemon side and trying to look at the way that the organisms that we know better than Pokemon, the organisms that we know how they reproduce, trying to look at them for some inspiration and for some insight, and then, deciding to make a basically an hour-long series that talks about the real life version of things and then trying to apply that to Pokemon. So I don't know that focusing on Pokemon necessarily stifles me in terms of which topics I can talk about, but for at least for your case, Gavin, I can definitely see that. Like if you're trying to make a channel that is about science and you're just using Pokemon as a starting point, maybe you don't have the starting point that you need for that particular topic.
Yeah, but I definitely want to circle back to something that you had mentioned a couple minutes ago about trying to relate Pokemon too hard to the real world.
Yeah.
Because, and like, I want to be clear, I'm not throwing any form of shade at anybody. Because I truthfully really enjoy this series, and I was actually involved in one of the revisions of it, Birdkeeper Toby's Tree of Life.
Oh yeah.
Excellent project. I love that series. And obviously the poster is like really beautiful. The art for it is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But these are Pokemon, not animals. And he's using the scientific names and classifications of real-world animals and potentially plants. I don't remember how he quite went about plants. But that's just not... You can't do that. Because there are very specific characteristics, particularly with fossils, but also with, living organisms as well, where it's like each taxonomic classification, its family, its genus, its species, has a very specific, pretty arbitrary, the more you learn about how we give scientific names to things, the more you learn that like a lot of it is kind of arbitrary, but it is very, so it doesn't necessarily matter where you draw the line between, this genus and this genus, but each genus or any other taxonomic rank has a very specific set of characteristics that indicate whether an organism is or is not in that group. And just given how little we know about Pokemon, there's just no way to do that. Especially because it's like, I think I had mentioned, I don't even remember what video it was, but I was like, we don't even know for sure that like the vast majority of Pokemon have bones on the inside of their body. It's like, we know a couple. We've seen a Dragonite skeleton in Black and White, and we've seen a Kabutops and Aerodactyl skeleton in Generation 1. That's pretty much it.
Never thought of that.
Yeah.
So we have no idea. And so trying to put real-world taxonomic names to them doesn't really work in my book. If you wanted to try to classify them and then give them your names yourself, I think that's an amazing idea, and that's something that I wanted to do for a really long time. Using like real professional software that we use to make real life trees of life, but there's just so little information available, plus that's extraordinarily time consuming.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't really have the time to commit to that.
Yeah, that sounds really cool to me. But yeah, no, I also really like Toby's Tree of Life as much as I disagree with it. But like for me, the main contention that I have with it is that ultimately all Pokemon can reproduce with each other. Like
more or less, yeah.
Well, yeah, there's like the legendary Pokemon that that either don't reproduce or we'd have never seen them reproduce. But all the like common Pokemon, ultimately they can all breed with each other because all of the egg groups, they all have some Pokemon that is in multiple egg groups, so they're all ultimately connected. You're able to trace any kind of like not necessarily passing a specific egg move, but like pick any two Pokemon and then find a way to make their lineages meet.
Yeah.
And so having that kind of tree structure where it's like a trunk that separates into branches, but the branches are all like individual, right? That doesn't work for me because they have to connect. For me, it's more of like a circle thing. Like obviously there's still relationships in terms of how they developed, how closely related they are. But just because something, just because a Pokemon looks like a fish and a different Pokemon looks like a rock, doesn't mean that they aren't also closely related by, I don't know, something like an Omastar or something that can breed both with the fish side and with the rock side. I don't know if Omastar is a good example of that. I don't know what its egg groups are off the top of my head, but something like that.
In that sense, it's a lot more. So, like, a little background for anybody who might not know. Bacteria are really, really hard to classify into species because while most of them don't reproduce sexually, where two different individuals come and exchange or combine part of their genome to create another, a lot of them do what's called horizontal gene transfer. So two completely unrelated, not even close to like the same species or genus or anything closely related at all, can just sort of meet up and they can just swap genes with each other. Is that individual now a new species? This is what Pokemon reminds me a lot of, and there's a very good reason. why I never made a video about Pokemon genetics, because, and I applaud you for trying to tackle it like you did, because I knew that was something I was never going to touch because I don't understand it.
No, it's definitely a difficult topic, especially when we can't do our own experiments, right?
Exactly.
We can only work within the constraints of the game. We can't figure out if we think like, oh, what if I put a Lugia with something else, in this particular situation, are they going to breed? No, because the game says they don't breed, period. But
and it even gets a little more tricky in Generation 8, because now you can pass egg moves without breeding. And I'm like, I don't even know what to do with that.
I think they're just teaching each other, but
I'm sure. But it was always, I had always assumed that it was some sort of genetic thing because the Pokemon hatched from the egg knowing it.
Yeah.
Oh, Pokemon.
Yeah. Well, let's circle back to the education side. As I was mentioning before, most of us are not experts. Most of us are lay people. Do you think that there's an advantage to essentially being taught by a layperson, by someone who is, I guess, just kind of like doing the research for you and distilling that knowledge?
It's like getting a tutor. The tutor is teaching themselves more about their topic, and they're also relaying it to you because they're familiar in your position. Everyday people are just approachable. When I see a professor teaching about history, I respect them because they're going to teach me something I never heard of before. But when I see somebody who is just a hobbyist, I'm like, huh, okay, they're going to teach me something I have heard before, but in a new way so I can understand it better.
That's a good point.
Yeah. And I think it's a little, so again, sort of going back to being a little arbitrary, where do you draw the line? Like, when does one become, a content expert in whatever they're doing? Because I would argue that, although to my knowledge he does not have any form of degree in science, Loxton knows much more about a broader variety of science than I do. Like, for example, his video about Electivire is one of my favorite videos of all time, just because I am really bad at physics. I don't understand physics very well. And so that video broke it down in a way that I could not have done even if I wanted to. And so I would argue that, Loxton is potentially much more expert than, a lot of other people making content on it. A, just because he's been doing it for so long, and B, because he's just really good at it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I can agree with you there. There's a lot of people that I watch on YouTube that aren't really expert, that not degree holding experts in their field, but they know just as much as a professor or someone who's, well, I guess that's actually a thing to bring up. If you study something all your life, you are an expert. You just never had an academic institution go and hand you a piece of paper saying, hey, you're an expert.
Right.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But I definitely think it's absolutely a positive for, quote unquote lay people to be some of the educators, because A, they're much more approachable. And that's part of something that I've been discovering sort of in my own life relatively recently, is that I'm trying to, when I started my master's degree, I fully intended to, go and get a PhD afterward and end up teaching at a university, that whole stereotypical scientist gig. But then, during COVID, I realized how really bad our science communication is, just as a society. And so that has made me want to direct much more of my time and efforts into that. I'm not at all a medical person. I've never taken any kind of medical class. I know anatomy, and that's the extent of my medical knowledge. But just getting people interested in science in general is a lot easier, because for better, or as I think I would definitely argue for worse, we have a very anti-expert or anti-academic mentality, especially, this might not be the same for you, Liebers, being in Canada, but in the United States, that is absolutely a thing.
Oh, we have that here too. It might be a smaller movement or a smaller portion of the population, but we definitely have that here too.
So I feel like having people who aren't seen as being up in that ivory tower is absolutely a net benefit, just because they're going to be able to get in the door. YouTube might be a little different with this because, you know, YouTube itself is just a generally really different environment, whereas if you were to see, you know, as sort of politicized as he has kind of been, like Dr. Fauci, on some major news network, a large portion of people are going to just instantly turn the channel. Whereas if it's somebody you know, or somebody not seen as this authoritative figure, you're much more likely to just have a, you know, regular conversation with this person.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think also, like, being someone who is not an expert in a topic also helps kind of guard against becoming too technical. You know, it helps prevent the information that you're passing on from being too dense. If I'm talking about something that I maybe don't, or at least didn't understand that well until I did this research, I feel like I would have an easier time communicating that without like using jargon, without using very technical terms, or at least without having to like define every single thing that I say. Mm-hmm. So that definitely feels like an advantage. Where I think it might become a problem is two things. One, if we miss something or we mischaracterize something and we don't realize it because we don't know well enough to like, we don't know enough to be able to tell that we're wrong. And so we could inadvertently give some wrong information. So that's one thing that I think can be a problem.
Yeah, wrong information is something scary with edutainment, because it people get really enthralled in it and don't realize that maybe they're being lied to. It's part of the reason I despise groups like PragerU and Grovel Institute, because they're taking political ideology and making it look like they're an actual educational institution teaching you something factual, and it just irks me so much.
For sure. I mean, I watched a PragerU video years ago without knowing what they were, and I don't remember what the topic was, but I remember the feeling of just like halfway into the video still being like, okay, like this is informative, and then by the end of the video being like, well, that was weird. That took a turn. And then I think the other problem is related to that. If the viewer doesn't understand what it means that you're not an expert, that they might take whatever you're saying at face value and just be like, oh, well, yeah, like I heard this on Libris's channel. Libris is someone that I trust, therefore I'm not going to question it.
I have that. I actually was very scared when I was brainstorming Pokemon psychology, because something you'll learn in psychology is that the brain is incredibly powerful. And if I teach you about a mental disorder and you think you might have it, but you've never been diagnosed, you can make yourself show symptoms. And I was thinking for the longest time that I would need to put like a warning at the beginning of the videos that I am just a hobbyist. Do not take my word as professional. If you think you have an issue, go seek a professional. And I don't do that. I'm hoping that hopefully people will understand that. Don't take me talking about Cyrus or Ghetsis' god complex as you having a god complex. No, calm down.
Yeah, but it's just tricky, right? Because obviously you want people to be able to trust what you're saying, but you also don't want people to trust it so much that you inadvertently mislead them.
I think one of the good things that we can all try to just push is, thank you for watching the video. I hope you learned something, but I hope you have an interest in learning more on your own.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I really hate how like corrupted sort of the phrase like doing your own research has become.
Yeah.
Because at face value, that is objectively a good thing. But there is literally no way that, like, for example, with like COVID things, there is no research that I could feasibly do that would be better than what the CDC does.
Yeah.
And so not all research should be weighted equally. And that is a big message that a lot of people miss. It's like, if I find one scientific paper that says this thing and 50 other scientific papers that say something else, that's you need to be as unbiased as you can. Like, we all have biases. That's a really important thing in science, is acknowledging your biases. But many people see acknowledging and admitting biases as like weakness or something. And so, especially when you're doing your own research, if you find things that support your already preconceived thought, you need to, I think, start actively looking for things that go against your, preconceived thought, just to see, okay, is there logic behind that, or are they, just kind of waffling,
And to the point of doing your own research, not everyone is going to do research equally well.
Right.
Like, even if it's just in terms of reading papers or performing small, at-home experiments. Like, specifically, I'm thinking of like flat earthers who will like take a spirit level on an airplane and being like, clearly we are not going around the Earth because the spirit level isn't moving. That is flawed, but they or their audience might not realize how that's flawed and might not be able to tell, on purpose or not, because I'm not going to pretend like everyone who's a flat earther is intentionally trying to mislead people. But you simply might not realize why that is flawed.
As someone who admits that they sucked at research just a few years ago, it's a skill. You have to learn it.
For sure.
And school does not teach you that. I only learned how to research properly because I went out of my way to take a dual credit English class in high school. If I hadn't done that, I probably wouldn't have learned how to research until I was in college, which is something that people don't have to go to.
Exactly.
Yeah, you have to know how to research, and you also have to know which sources that you can trust, right? You have to know whether when a certain person or a certain channel or whatever says something, whether that is something that you need to double check or not.
When you're reading an article about comparative religion and folklore, and suddenly you're seeing a lot of opinions start coming in, that's when you know it's time to hop off the article.
Yeah.
Most Pokemon creators, if not all, were not very good at sourcing our information.
Yeah.
Oh.
I very rarely see someone make a scientific claim, and then actually tell us or put on screen or whatever where that information came from.
Yeah. I do that now. I didn't used to do that, but now I do it. I have a little references section. I write it in plain text, so you can just type it into Google exactly how I wrote it there, and it'll pop right up.
That sounds
just because
great.
Citations are a pain, and I hate citations.
Yeah.
Citations are kind of annoying, yeah. But, like, a lot of times I feel like it's probably not necessary if you're just trying to communicate a well-understood topic. If your source is just kind of the general knowledge about this topic, maybe you don't need to source everything.
Yeah, there's something in citations where like you don't actually have to cite that if it's common knowledge.
Right. But yeah, like there is a line, right? There is a line beyond which you probably should start citing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that, going back to sort of maybe like the advantages and disadvantages to having like a layperson as the presenter, for a lot of, especially like anatomy things, that's just things that I've been taught and that I know. So it's like, I don't even think to cite that. That's just, when I'm writing a script, I usually don't need to look that kind of thing up. And that's something that I kind of take for granted. So that's definitely like a disadvantage, because I'm sure, some people would, like to look up more about it, especially with scientific terms. They can be pretty notoriously hard to spell.
Yep.
Or sometimes just hard to find, because we commonly name other things similar things to them in a very confusing way. So, yeah, going forward, that's definitely something that because I remember having that thought with the podcast a handful of times, where it's like, I need to find like something to direct people to, because I know I'm not going to be able to do this like the best amount of justice, and that there are definitely other viewpoints on a topic that I think other people should read that we just don't have time to get into. But yeah, that's definitely something that I feel like everybody, just in general, whether you're a content creator or some rando on like Facebook, cite sources, please.
Yeah, I didn't do that for the longest time because I was honestly just embarrassed. I was afraid that my references or my resources were going to be pointed out as flawed or something. And that was partially just me still learning the research method. I'm much better at it now, and now I'm confident in being like, hey, yeah, I got it from this .org site that is talking all about the Milgram experiment. Here you go. But even now, like, sometimes I hesitate, but like Bulbapedia, like, should I put that in there? I mean, I did use them as a foundation, but
Yeah.
because I don't want to feel like it's going to discredit me because I used it as a foundation.
I think that comes back to just the general fear that most people have of being like corrected. And that's something that I have, like, in my life, like, growing up and, through high school and early college, I was part of that as well. But it's something that, like, I've actively worked on, to being like, if somebody corrects me and they genuinely know more than me, to be very humble about that. Because, for the most part, they're not trying to be malicious. More often than not, they're trying to help you. And like with somebody, if I had something in a video and somebody in the comments was like, if they sort of hit me with the, well, actually, to not immediately get defensive, as most people are kind of prone to doing. And I feel like that's something that, just in general, the internet can be a really toxic place.
Yeah.
So being a little more humble is something I think everybody should be able to do, or should try to do anyway.
Yeah, the way that I've been trying to address that issue of sourcing is to just have the expert on. If I have a biologist talking about biology, if I have a linguist talking about linguistics, if I have a furry talking about furry culture, like that is my source, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah.
It is not, I didn't read this somewhere and I'm interpreting it. This is just a conversation that, like, I'm giving it straight from the expert to the audience, with maybe a little bit of extra interpretation of how that specifically applies to Pokemon, because that is the topic that I'm talking about. But I just find it, well, more interesting for me. I get to learn more. Because if I'm doing my own research, I'm often going to end up, whatever is my like preconceived notion of what about that topic applies to Pokemon, that's the direction I'm going to go in. And talking to an expert will almost always take me someplace that I didn't expect. So I find that more interesting. And I mean, I'm not my own viewer, so who knows? But I also find it more compelling when I'm viewing other people's work. I like seeing the expert.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I think this is a good place for us to open up the floor. This question from Barmander, we have touched on it a little bit already, but they want to know what our preferred research process is. Like, if you have any sites that you favor, and more specifically, what your thoughts on are using Wikipedias or just wikis in general as sources.
You want to go first, Gav, or?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so like we've talked about, Bulbapedia is the main sort of starting off point that I've kind of used, other than, that or just sort of scrolling through the Pokedex and sort of just like, oh, that Pokemon looks fun to talk about today. And then from there, like I said, the science side of Wikipedia is actually quite reliable, mostly, well, the asterisk of probably non-medical things. I probably wouldn't trust it for medical things. Especially these days with how weirdly politicized medicine has become. But for like geology, nobody cares enough about geology to go in and screw with it. So for that kind of thing, Wikipedia is actually quite reliable, as well as historical things about scientists I've found to also be quite reliable, just because for people, for example, like Charles Darwin, who you might think people might want to come in and, troll on Darwin's Wikipedia page, the people who care about Darwin care so much, so anything that gets changed on there would like immediately get changed back. So Wikipedia is more reliable than high school English class makes it seem. The best part about Wikipedia, in my opinion, is that they are actually generally really good about citing sources. So reading the Wikipedia article itself is probably not a great place to get your actual information that you're citing from. But if you follow the citation, you say you read an interesting section on a wiki article, and then you follow the citation down to the end of the page, and then read wherever they cited from, that's like even while doing my master's, that's where I got some of my sources from for my thesis. So it's more reliable than it is made out to be.
For me, I also start with Wikipedia as a little bit of a foundation. I used to rely on it as a crutch more than I do now. Now I just look at it and be like, okay, what observations did people make? I write down those observations, I go confirm them, and maybe while researching, I'll be like, well, they missed this, so let me just talk about this and add that in. But my preferred research method is actually books. I actually asked Libris for some books earlier, and I did purchase some. I have the Book of Yokai, Pandemonium and Night Parade, a dictionary of symbolic and mythological animals, traditional symbiology, fantastic creatures, a Chinese classic, a religion textbook, and a psychology textbook on my desk right now. And I just immediately grabbed them when I'm looking up for something. Especially, I love bestiaries because I can just be like, okay, what's the owl in Chinese mythology? And I'll go read a bit about it and be like, all right, let me go look at this and confirm and add a little bit more details. And I'll be writing at the same time while I'm researching. And it's just, I love it. Public libraries, my school's research library. I go to the Library of Congress. I make sure I go to .org and gov sites quite frequently just to confirm. Usually when I'm talking about a specific point, whether it be like a specific yokai, I will go to multiple different sources that I have access to just to make sure that I'm getting all the details I can, because sometimes folklore stories change from region to region, and that's something you can also mention. But for me, nothing beats that tactile feeling of having a book in your hand, flipping through the pages and being like, so I can talk about that.
Yeah, I honestly, I wish I could do more book-based research. I'm a very slow reader, unfortunately. I would read so much more if I could. But
yeah, I fall asleep while reading and it sucks.
yeah, so it's just not practical for me to do research for a video by reading entire or even partial books about the topic. I do use Wikipedia a lot, mostly as just like a grounding in what is already known about a topic. If it's something more complex, I will try to dig deeper than that. Sometimes I just do a Google search and see what comes up, and sometimes it's like there might be a National Geographic article that is relevant, so I'll use that instead. But yeah, I find that Wikipedia is fairly reliable when it comes to just kind of general knowledge. If you're talking about a topic like medicine, where it's more kind of constantly evolving, you might want to be more careful with that. But for the most part, it's definitely a good starting point. I haven't had classes of any kind in, 7 years now? I haven't had a science class in, 10 years now? So even things that I have learned, I probably need a refresher on, and Wikipedia is good for that.
Yeah, I'm the same way with Wikipedia. I like using it as a foundation and refresher of knowledge, especially psychology. because I only ever took an AP Psych class, and I just really was enthralled with the subject. But that was also during the lovely time that we all call senioritis, and I was not paying attention.
Yeah.
I may have upset my teacher when I passed the AP exam, even though I didn't do his homework for half the year. Sorry. But I like using a variety of resources as well to confirm stuff. So not only books, but I will go to edutainment content creators who talk about mythology and use them, because to me, they are experts in that, because mythology and folklore is our stuff. It's not something you can really do a research, like a scientific method on, because it's stories from people. And even if you change a bit of folklore yourself, rewrite it, retell it, it's still folklore. It's your version. And I'm kind of doing that in a video that's supposed to have been out a year ago, but damn it. Oh, sorry, I swore. Apologies for that.
That's fine.
But I retold the story of, I believe it's called the Harry Onaga, which is Hattereen's inspiration.
Oh, cool.
Okay.
I basically just took someone's folklore story, rewrote it, and made my own character, and I'm going to try to deliver it properly, which is a little difficult given that I'm basically just a souped up PowerPoint presentation. But I will try my best. But using other sources like that, I love doing videos, ebooks, articles. Something I really wish I'd do more is expert stuff. I did a video on the Pueblo, and I really wish I just went and found a way to contact one of their tribesmen to actually learn about the Pueblo, because I don't think I did it justice. And that video got very popular for some reason, and it's probably because I misspelled Pueblo, and I didn't catch it at all.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to tell why a particular video is popular. But it is unfortunate when you can tell why it's popular and it's not for a good reason.
Yeah.
So this question is from Indigo. What are your thoughts on access to information? Like, some things that I research require you to pay for that research paper. Sometimes you can have an excerpt, but not the whole thing, or to see the method or who's paying for the research, that kind of thing might be behind the paywall.
I have very strong thoughts about this.
I will go first because my thoughts are less strong. But I'm a big proponent in making knowledge free. I watched public broadcasting for a lot of my childhood, and I learned so much from it. I despise how expensive college textbooks are. I try my best to use free resources. I even looked into alternative databases. Like, okay, is there any database that's open access? And boom, I found one. It's an Indian database, but it's from a national university there, and they just run it, and it's just open access database. I'm like, oh, sweet. I wish more stuff was available. Like, my obsession with having books, yeah, it gets expensive, but I go and try my best to, like, if it's an old book, Gutenberg.org is usually somewhere where you can find it, because Aristotle's rhetoric and Confucius's analects will be there, though the translated version might not be, because the translated versions have new copyrights. But if they don't have a copyright on them, they're public domain, there's plenty of resources out there where you can find them, and it's especially useful for finding folklore. The only problem with that, though, is it's usually written in its original format, which can be incredibly difficult to read and understand for a modern person.
So my school that I went to for grad school was one of it was a fairly small school, but a very heavy research school. It was an entirely STEM school. And even still, there were times where I would get locked out of papers that I needed for my thesis. I don't want to advocate for piracy, but there are several websites. I will not mention them out of courtesy for Libris. If this was my own channel, I would name them all day.
You go ahead. If it's to make information more available, you go ahead.
Okay, there's this wonderful website called Sci-Hub. It is a little sketchy, I'm not going to lie, but I have not gotten a virus from it so far. But you more or less, if you find a citation to almost any, as long as it isn't fresh off the presses, pretty much any scientific paper, you put the citation in their website and it will spit you out a PDF of it. And my thesis would not have been done without it. That's how extreme the paywall situation is, even at high research at institutions, because Many people fundamentally misunderstand what being a scientist is, because many people, especially around like climate change, are like, oh, they're only publishing these papers so they can make a lot of money. And I'm like, okay, but like publishing papers costs money. So if I were to publish a paper in, say, Nature or Science, it would cost me probably a few $1,000s. And then even if 1 million, 2 million, 5 million people read that article, I would not get a dime. All of that money goes to the publisher, not me, because when you publish through a journal, you give them the copyright license to that work. And so with these being companies trying to be profitable, and the profit margins are absolutely insane. There's actually a really wonderful documentary about it that is completely open source for obvious reasons. It's called Paywall the Movie. You can just go to paywallthemovie.org and you can just watch it for free. It's about an hour long. It's about the entire publishing industry and how horrible it is, in a way that people, even me as a scientist, did not understand truly until I watched that movie. But the more simple answer is, if you find a paper that's behind a paywall, if you can find the email of one of the authors, shoot him an email. Almost all the time. I've yet to meet a scientist who would not happily send somebody a PDF of one of their papers, if to just a regular non-academic person who sent them an email about it, just because we also hate that things are stuck behind paywalls. We want people to read our stuff. That's the reason we write it.
I try to avoid piracy anymore now that I've gotten just a bit older, especially books, because I do love books, and I know of a website where books can be easily pirated. I try to refrain from doing it, and if I do it, I'm only using it for the reference, and then I'm deleting the file, because I'm not going to sit here and enjoy someone's hard work, especially if they self-published.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that.
But I advocate people go to your public library. They have extensive resources, even databases if you're in a bigger city. I have yet to really find a time where I haven't went to my public library's website and just typed in a keyword and found 1 or 2 books on it. Granted, it's not as useful as bigger cities, because my poor library has moved locations several times and has been... Oh, man, I wish I could support them better. But their collection has been reduced by like 80%. And it really sucks to see all that knowledge go because they couldn't afford it. Mm-hmm. But if you have access to a public library, use it, support it, show that it's actually needed in your community, because they are.
Yeah, and always remember, libraries don't only have books. Libraries also have movies, documentaries. Yeah. They have ebooks as well if you don't want to get a print copy. And access to databases as well.
Mine lets you check out cooking pans. It's great.
Wow,
pans.
That's awesome.
Oh yeah, that's great. I hadn't seen that one before. All right. Well, Gavin, what do you have to plug for our listeners?
So if you feel so inclined, even though that I probably will not be uploading to it anytime soon, but we have the Palette University YouTube channel. Stuff that I'm doing much more currently is the podcast that I've mentioned a couple times. It's called I Wish You Were Dead. You can find it pretty much anywhere you can get your podcasts, as well as we're really trying to grow sort of our Twitter side of things, because I do retweet a lot of open source paleontology articles on that Twitter as well, and that is deadpodcast_. So that's most of what I spend a lot of my sort of research efforts on these days.
Sounds good. Yeah, I recommend the podcast as well. I listen to it every week.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I think it's very informative. Even when it's a topic that I feel like I'm more familiar with, there's also always some angle that I wasn't aware of before. So I definitely recommend it. How about you, Derek? What do you have to plug?
Well, if you look at my channel, it seems like I'm dead. And that's primarily because of a personal problem that's been affecting me for a long time now, and it's been getting worse. But I'm still very much wanting to make videos. If you enjoy psychology, folklore, mythology, even business, as I'm a business administrations major and I look at Pokemon as a business rather than as a customer, well, sometimes. If you enjoy stuff like that, looking at the educational side of stuff, and occasionally getting a theory or a countdown or even a remix, as I've been dabbling in music creation lately. That my channel is just Derek Triforce on YouTube. Same with Twitter, but I'm not too active on that. But if you're interested in that, just go check it out. Pop a little subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. I'm very attentive with my comments. I tend to reply to just about every single one if there's a little effort put into them.
Yeah, we are all small channels here, so a subscription, a comment, it goes a long way. It means a lot to all of us.
Give me my daily dose of dopamine, please. No.
All right, well, thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, Derek, for bringing this topic to me, and thanks, Gavin, of course, to joining us as well. This podcast was produced on the territory of the Lekwungen people, and it is edited by me, Brian Libris. The music that you're hearing now and at the start of the show is Critique City by Braxton Brooks. You can listen to more episodes of Tin Tower Talks in our YouTube archive. The playlist for that is linked in the description of this episode. And if you'd like to support the show, you can do so at patreon.com/UmbrianLibris. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next chapter.